very good evening to you all and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Dr. Nyasha Gondora and I'm the leader of the Untitled Chapter of the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation, the CSCA. So for the benefit of those who are joining us tonight for the very first time, let me tell you a bit about what the CSCA does and what our mandate is. So the CSCA was founded in 1973 and currently has 11 chapters across the different territories and provinces of Canada. And we have membership ranging from scientists, philosophers, theologians, students from all disciplines, and really anyone in the community who's interested in the faith and science dialogue. So welcome to you all. We're excited to have you here tonight. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd like to make a very quick announcement about our next event. So on March 11th, we have the privilege of having Dr. Arnold Sikema from Trinity Western University in British Columbia speaking to us on Big Bang cosmology and creation. It's going to be exciting. We hope to see you there. And tonight, we're very, very honored to have with us here Dr. Janet Warren speaking on her book, All Things Wise and Wonderful, a Christian understanding of how and why things happen in light of COVID-19. Janet, congratulations on the publication of this amazing book, and we're so excited to hear from you tonight. So before I hand over the virtual mic to Dr. Warren, I'll briefly tell you about her background. So Dr. Warren is an interdisciplinary scholar in the fields of theology, family medicine, and psychotherapy. She was the past president of the CSCA and is currently the leader of the Hamilton chapter of the CSCA. So once again, welcome, Janet, and we're so excited to hear from you tonight.
Thank you so much, Nyasha, and thank you so much for letting me share about my passion, my interests. So I'm sure most of you have figured out that it takes more than a year to write a book in general, particularly a multidisciplinary one. So this project has been in the works long before COVID. There's many streams that led me to this interest. I know many people always like to hear sort of the backstory, the story behind the book. So it's been on my radar for many years. But a few years ago, I was presenting at a conference, theology conference, and my topic was on the voice of God. Well, wouldn't you? And I actually had two presentations that conference. And wouldn't you know it, a week before I developed a virus with a hacking cough and hacked out my vocal cords. So I arrived with barely a whisper to my voice. The first person I encountered said with a meaningful voice, well, someone didn't want you presenting here. You know, the subtext that there's the devil's trying to stop me. The next person I encountered said, oh, well, God had a plan for this so that your presentation would be more meaningful. And each time I sort of whispered, it's just a virus. So I had in mind that actually as a title for my book. And then COVID happened and that title didn't really seem appropriate anymore. I also realized that the COVID pandemic provided many, many illustrations for what I've been trying to talk about. So I'm not obviously going to present the entire book. I'm going to jump around in it and sort of focus on the more fun aspects, and warning, you will be asked to participate at times. Okay, so let's start with the participation. And Mark is going to show a brief video. And in the chat screen, I would like you all to tell me what's happening in that video. Okay, I'm not seeing any responses. Oh, I've got one. I believe that your responses can be anonymous, but even if they're not, don't worry, this isn't school, anything goes. Don't overthink, it's just for fun. The problem is I've probably got quite a few scientists here. So you're all trying to analyze and you're all trying to think, well, what's the real answer and what's going on? So we've got a few responses. Yep, chaos, a few amusing things. But a few of you are saying things like there's a big bad triangle that breaks things. A few people have no idea, and that's because they're probably trying to think too scientifically. Old depiction of antibiotics. So antibodies, I mean. So in this is actually so a few people got the bullying word happening. So this is actually a classic experiment in psychology. It's called the homicidal illusion. Unsurprisingly, named after the people who invented it. And the majority of people, so basically we've got triangles and two triangles in a circle, but the majority of people, okay, and there I see Judy's is familiar with this illusion. So when they did the study, the majority of people made up a story about it, as in, the big triangle as a bully. Some would even say things like there's two men fighting over a girl and the girl hides in the box. But the point is everybody makes up a story. And you might wonder, what on earth has this got to do with COVID-19? Except the circle maybe looks a little bit like the coronavirus. But the point is, it's an illustration of how much humans like and need stories and meaning. And here's your little cue. When scary things happen, like a pandemic, we try and make a story around it to understand it, except sometimes, hint, hint, there's no real story. In addition to telling stories, we also like to ask questions. And give me a second here. Kids in particular, as soon as they learn to talk, and those who are parents who've been around kids, we know we get tired of the why. As soon as they learn to talk, they ask questions. And asking questions and interacting with the world is how they understand it. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it hilarious when babies throw their food across the room and learn and, unroll all the toilet paper. But what they're doing is they're learning cause and effect relationships. They're learning how the world works. It's been said that all our knowledge is based on cause and effect relationships. We view the world through a causal lens. So the toddler discovers that biting their sibling causes a squeal, and well, that's very funny, so they do it again. But then they learn that mommy doesn't like that, so they stop doing it. An interesting study was done on preschoolers, asking them to explain why rocks are pointy. And almost all of them came up with purposeful or teleological explanations, saying things like, so animals can scratch themselves, whereas in reality, the wind and erosion, etc., as we know, causes the pointiness of rocks. In another interesting study, you may be familiar with B.F. Skinner, the classic behaviorist. Well, he took a break in the cage and he looked at pigeons, and pigeons were given rewards at random intervals. What was very surprising, that the pigeons developed these ritualistic behaviors. So they would peck before they got the reward. They would maybe run around in circles or just do some bizarre behaviors, almost like they couldn't imagine that something could happen without nothing causing it to happen. And then, of course, psychologists, being psychologists, they take the same sort of thing and apply it to preschoolers, where there's this crazy clown that dispenses treats from his mouth, again, at random intervals. And what happens is these 4 and 5-year-olds start engaging in ritualistic behaviors. So whether they do a little dance or something, but it's almost like they have trouble understanding that things could just occur randomly. And of course, both of these help form the basis for superstitious behaviors. And we've all heard about some of the superstitions that have occurred during the COVID pandemic. So we won't blame all the kids and the pigeons anymore. We'll look at adults. As I've mentioned, adults often have difficulty understanding causation. We'd like things to be a simple A causes B, a simple linear relationship. So since we always need vacation slides in any presentation, this is when I was doing some volunteer teaching in Thailand, and the students it was a program called Barefoot Doctors, and they were Burmese students who took basic medical care to where it was needed, where there was no doctor. So because of my experience in counseling, they had devotional times in the evening, and they asked me to help teach some counseling. So we had them do role plays around a patient who was diagnosed with cancer. And invariably, they all came up with, don't worry, God has a plan, or God. And when I asked them specifically, said, God caused the cancer. And they seem to have forgotten earlier in the day when we were talking about the many different causes of cancer, such as, environmental toxins, etc. And now, granted, maybe they were thinking in different types of questions, but I strongly believe that our science and faith should be integrated, and our questions should be able to cover all aspects of what's happening in the world. We see this simplistic understanding. I've already mentioned the conspiracy theories, but even on a smaller scale. So if maybe you have a friend who gets COVID after shopping at a particular grocery store, and then you avoid going to that grocery store, even though logically you know that your friend could have got it from anywhere and that you can get it from many other places as well. But we tend to make quick associations. We tend to like simple stories and easy explanations. In particular, in Christian circles, this is illustrated in a lot of cliches. So the old everything happens for a reason. God closes a door, he opens a window. It's our way of making sense of a world that is sometimes arbitrary, a world in which random pandemics sometimes happen. And the inconsistency people are not often aware of, but it can be amusing. So a lot of people will talk about the pandemic being in God's hands, but they still wash their own hands. All of these misunderstandings, and I'm sure you've encountered many as well, and I see it particularly in my counseling practice, but also just in everyday life, result from inadequate understandings of causation and cause and effect relationships. Now, I know at this point, some of you might want to glaze over because we're going to do a brief foray into philosophy and talk about the definition of causation. So, cause makes something happen. It's very foundational and intuitive. As I've mentioned, it's present in even very young children. They've done studies even in infants they do it by checking how long they look at something. And when two things don't make sense, they will look longer. Understanding causations, not only, it's important because I believe God calls us to understand our world, but it's also important because how we understand causation will determine our responses. So if we think an evil spirits caused the pandemic, then our response should be to pray and practice deliverance. If we believe that cell phone towers caused it, well, that's going to be a very different response. So it is important that we have a proper understanding of causation. Now, good old Aristotle was one of the first to really examine causation and our desire for knowledge and our need to ask, our need to know, and our need to ask questions. He helpfully suggested 4 levels of causation. So the first one is material, so the nature of things. So the desk that I'm sitting at right now is made of wood. Then the second level, which I always find less helpful, but anyway, it's about more the intrinsic or interactional aspects of the thing. So the wood becomes a desk, it doesn't become a chair, for example. The efficient level is the one that we deal with most in probably daily life and in science, and it's what we commonly think of in terms of cause. And it's about a process or an agent that causes a change of something. So many of you are familiar with the scientific method, where you start with something and then you intervene and then you check to see if there's been a change. And then the final level, which we're also familiar with because it's more related to faith and Christianity, it's the purpose of a thing. Going back to the desk, the efficient cause would have been the carpenter, machines, whatever that actually made the wood into a desk. And then the final cause of the purpose of my desk is so I can sit at it and have my computer on it and give presentations on causation. When we think about final, we need to realize that everything interacts, and we also need to realize that not all of these levels are present in every situation. So, for example, with respect to the COVID pandemic, I'm not convinced there is any particular purpose to it. So not all the levels are not present all the time, but it can be a helpful way of understanding causation. Another helpful aspect of it is looking at models of causation. So the simple one we already talked about, A causes B. Variation of that is a chain. So A causes B, causes C, causes D. So, and again, those are things we're familiar with. If we follow a pattern for sewing or knitting or something, or a recipe for cooking, you follow stepwise a process to get to the end result. However, there's also forked models. So in a fork, you can have a common cause. For example, if the cause is the coronavirus, it can cause a cough and a fever and a few other things. You can also have a common effect. So a cough can be caused by the coronavirus, but it can also be caused by allergies, irritation, etc. So you're already starting to understand that causation is a little bit more than a simple A causes B. Now, unfortunately, most of life is best modeled by complex models of causation, and best illustrated by a causal salad. So where there's multiple different factors interacting in multiple different ways, that it becomes almost impossible to figure out what's causing what. And I believe, and many of you might be familiar with this, is chaos complexity theory, and those web-like models that you may have seen. Many of us have become a little bit more familiar with this during the pandemic because we've been exposed to various graphs, etc., on the news, and we've been exposed to some models that show, in particular, how a disease is transmitted. Speaking of disease transmissions, the field of epidemiology in medicine is particularly helpful. So epidemiology studies occurrences of diseases in large populations, which is different from me as an individual family physician looking at an individual patient. So I use statistical methods and look at how common it is, how it might be spreading. They can make projections based on what's been happening. Also helps to determine the source and causes of it. There's various models, but one helpful one in epidemiology is the triad. So diseases are caused by an interaction between the environment, the host or the person who is affected, and the agent. So in this case, and by the way, note that there's some similarities already to Aristotle's levels of causation. So with COVID-19, the host is, like I said, the infected person. But that affected person also comes with their own baggage, like their age, their previous health, etc. The agent is the novel coronavirus, and the environment includes things like contaminated surfaces, the air quality, how the person was exposed to the virus. So again, you might be wondering, well, where is God in this? So when we think, I believe, as a believer in the integration between science and faith, I believe that God can interact with these on all levels. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. And in case you didn't tune out already, some of you might want to tune out now because we're going to talk about scary statistics. However, statistics is not that scary. It's really tough on Zoom because I can't hear people laughing, but oh well, hopefully you like my corny cartoon. So statistics is actually a helpful science. It helps tame uncertainty. And like I said, we've seen many examples of this during the pandemic. It can take individual cases and extrapolate from them. And like most of science, it's a tool that's used for understanding cause and effect. But remember that it's at the large level, not at the individual level. So it talks in terms of probabilities, etc. But actually, for those of you who are tuned out, you need to tune back in again because we have a poll coming up. And I will stop my sharing. So. Okay, so most of you chose other, and it's either because you're just were playing it safe and figured out that it was maybe the safest answer. And it is actually correct. So this was a study done, and again, psychologists. They're all equally likely. So this relates to a statistical concept about the law of large numbers. So as you probably know, birth order is approximately 50-50. I mean, whether it's a boy or girl, it's approximately 50%. But it's only when you've got at least about 100 people with small numbers, those numbers are equally likely. But people have great difficulty understanding those statistics and understanding. They think that the law of large numbers, which is basically the more information you have, the more accurate you're going to be, they think it applies to small numbers as well. So, which can explain some of the bizarre behavior we see with people, changing the behavior based on one instance of something rather than looking at the big picture. And I like this quote from the mathematicians saying that the number of people on Earth, there are going to be strange things happen. Somebody's going to win the lottery. Pandemics can happen. In fact, many people predicted that it would just because we hadn't had a pandemic in many, many years. So another helpful statistical concept is probability or likelihood. And again, note this is applicable to large numbers. It's often expressed in terms of percentage, so we've probably come across this before. It can, I think it's also a helpful term to think about because from a Christian perspective, it can encourage humility when we talk more in terms of that something's likely or possible as opposed to being certain of things. And then a final concept is prior probability or the base rate, and it's the usual occurrence of something before a change. And it's very important to understand that because we don't know what caused something if we didn't know what things were like before the change. in addition to misunderstanding statistics, one of the other aspects of statistics we misunderstand is correlation and causation. So just because two things are associated does not mean that one caused the other. So the sun can cause a desire for ice cream. Sorry to tease you with these ideas right now in winter. The sun can also cause a sunburn, but fortunately, ice cream does not cause a sunburn. Another misunderstanding, here's another example of humorous correlations. It's data showing that revenue from ski facilities follows a similar pattern to people dying by being tangled in their bed sheets. I've been told this is accurate. So anyway, there's a website called Spurious Correlations, and it's quite amusing if you want to look at it. Okay, over to you for another poll. Okay. So this is a famous problem in psychology called the Linda problem, unimaginatively. And you guys did a little bit better than average. Probably some of you are familiar with it. So it's actually more probable, more likely that Linda is a bank teller, because the likelihood of one thing occurring alone is much higher than two things occurring together. I'll let you think about that a little bit. So of the number of bank tellers, there's a much higher number of people who are bank tellers. So this illustrates, again, how we like a story. And it's set up that it paints her as somebody who's active in the feminist movement. So we're sucked into the story rather than thinking about the statistics and thinking about the base rates and the prior probability. The prior probability of anybody being a bank teller in general is much higher than being a bank teller and something else. Another thing that we commonly ignore is silent evidence. So we only look at what we can see. A story apparently told by Cicero is about a painting of worshippers who survived a shipwreck after praying. However, a skeptical non-believer asked to see the pictures of those who prayed and then drowned. So we only think about what we see. We forget about what we don't see. We forget about what else might be happening behind the scenes. Okay, so let's look a little bit now, turn to what actually is happening in the world. So the nature of nature, first of all, there's order and regularity in the nature. We see this in the Bible. Sun rises and the sun goes down. Ecclesiastes talks about if clouds are full of water, they pour on the earth. When a tree falls to the south or the north, the place where it falls, there it will lie. The rain falls on the righteous and unrighteous. I'm not a fan of that verse, but that's another story. So people throughout the ages have observed nature. They don't necessarily have science as we know it today, but they have observed regularities in nature. And according to the Bible, God has created a world that has some self-causing abilities. Things happen. Gravity happens. So people tend to think about the Garden of Eden as being this perfect place. But think about it. If Adam climbed a tree and fell down, he could have broken a leg, just because it's the nature of the world. So that's one way of helping us to understand causation, is to see this order and regularity, laws of nature that have been built in. There's also amazing beauty in the regularity that we see in nature. And the pictures of the shell, the sunflower, and the galaxy all show those similar spiral patterns that can be described through mathematical formulas. It's called the golden ratio for those who want to know. It's related to fractals, which are repeated patterns in nature. So it's really amazing to look at. There's also redundancy built into nature. So there's many causal pathways to have one effect. Animals often have multiple offspring because they know that only a few will survive. So viruses, by nature, they self-replicate and they turn our cells into virus-producing machines. However, you guessed it, we also have difficulties sometimes with perceiving order and regularity in nature. So here's some examples you can just play with yourself. So think about or say aloud what the colors of the words on the left are. And you'll find yourself struggling because our brains automatically go to the words and not the color. Same with the illusion at the top right of the screen. The middle can be seen as a B or a 13, depending on the context. So these are all good things. This is the way remember, as I said, we grow up and we learn about cause and effect in the world and we learn how things work. But when an exception comes along, we have trouble. So it's a good, normal system, but the mistakes and the errors are almost like side effects of a good system. The bottom one is the Ebbinghaus illusion, and those circles are actually the same size. An interesting thing, too, is even when we know in our heads that it's wrong and that they are the same size, we can't not see it. We still see them as being different. So all of these things are just to, again, if it's not clear already, show that we're not very good judges of the way things work in the world. So in addition to order and regularity in the world, there's also chaos complexity. The famous butterfly effect you've probably heard of, sensitivity to initial conditions. So if a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil theoretically can cause a tornado in Texas. Chaos complexity theory also illustrates self-organization in nature. Schools of fish, and I don't think they're particularly intelligent creatures. No offense to the fish, all the fish lovers out there, but it's amazing how just following these sort of unwritten rules of follow the fish in front and stay close to the fish beside you, they can form a school of fish and move in formation, similarly with flocks of birds. Snowflakes too show these repetitive patterns and not so much self-organizing to a degree. But they, like I said, with the coronavirus, they're examples of how multiple factors interact to cause something that it can be very difficult to sort out an actual cause. Another aspect of the world is randomness, and which is an event without an easily discernible cause. It's unpredictable. And we often have trouble with randomness, especially as Christians, because we think, well, everything must have a purpose. But randomness is not the same as purposelessness. In fact, it's something God has created and it can be useful. It's used in farmers sowing seeds. They've used scatter with random patterns actually does better than planting it in organized patterns. And chance is referred to in a few occasions in the Bible. You may recall when people throw lots to make a decision. So our problem, okay, let's, another aspect of randomness, of course, you may have heard of is mutations, which is the probable cause of the coronavirus, is that another virus mutated and developed into this nasty one we're experiencing right now. Okay, time for another quiz. And this quiz is, which of the dots are random? Okay, again, you guys did better than the average person. Correct, the black ones are random. We often have difficulty recognizing randomness because of our neglect of sample size, our neglect of probabilities. We don't recognize when we have incomplete information. We also, on an emotional level, we don't like uncertainty. We like to see patterns and meaning. So briefly, causation in the Bible and the world. So what caused the pandemic? God, humans, natural, random factors, demons, multiple factors interacting. I think I've already hinted about the natural random factors, mutations and viruses, etc. But let's look a little bit at divine agency in theology. So certainly in the Bible, there's lots of examples of God causing something. However, it doesn't, because God causes some things does not necessarily mean that he micromanages and causes absolutely every little thing. He works through natural processes. As we mentioned, he created a world that is somewhat self-sustaining, and he also created humans to be with freedom and responsibility and calls us to care for the world. And you can just read these quotes. So in terms of human causation, I like to emphasize, there's often talk about free will. I think the term responsibility is a lot more helpful. So there's instructions for us to be in the Bible about us being responsible for our health. Many of you might be familiar with the statement from Biologos released this summer, I think, called Love Your Neighbor, Wear Your Mask, a Christian statement for pandemic times. The Bible talks a lot about concursus is the theological term for humans working alongside God. And I think that's what we're called to do, is work with God in healing people, working with God in preventing spread of disease. However, as I've said, often we have difficulty with our responsibility, and we have difficulty with randomness and with things happening for no particular reason. And it's easy to browse the web and find a lot about everything happens for a reason. And interestingly, this is not just a Christian cliche. It's a common in the many areas of life. We prefer stories to statistics. We tend to make our decisions more based on emotions than logic, which sometimes is helpful, but not always. We like to be in control. We like the world to make perfect sense. We like there to be a reason for everything. So there's an amusing story told by a theologian, Austin Farrer. He tells about a man who is sick, and his neighbors say, oh, well, he's ill because he drinks too much. He's an alcoholic. However, then they find out that he actually doesn't drink. So then they quickly say, oh, well, it must be a trial sent by God. Then, because he's ill, he doesn't go on a trip, and that trip ends up in disaster. And they say, oh, it's a blessing of providence. So it's an illustration of how we like to make up stories and we judge people, and also how hindsight is clear and we change our stories. And I've encountered this many times with people. They'll say something and then I ask and say, oh, well, this, or well, God only meant it for a time, etc. So because we like stories and meaning, the phrase thing, the idea that maybe God caused the pandemic to teach people a lesson, it's much more satisfying for us than the saying that, well, there's no particular cause for the pandemic, or there's many different possible causes for the pandemic. So what can we do with this? What can we do with the fact that there's sort of this mismatch? We've got this complicated world, and we've got the way that God interacts with the world is also somewhat complex. And yet we have these mind brains that don't like complexity and that look for simple solutions. So I think we can get help from science, psychology, and theology. So in terms of science, we need to, and again, this is for everybody. You don't have to be a scientist to think about this. We need to ask the right questions. Think about, okay, is this scientific? Is this about the nature of the world? We need to think about statistics, think about probabilities, think about that type of language. Think about what type of a situation is it? Is it a situation where there's likely to be one cause or many causes? We need to think about what are all the possible interpretations or possible factors that might explain something. At the psychological level, having some knowledge, I mean, you're already ahead because you've attended this presentation, but having some knowledge of our cognitive shortcomings, having some self-awareness, not just how our brains work, but also our personal emotions, our motivations. Why do we look for simple solutions? Are we really uncomfortable with uncertainty? Are we trying to be self-serving? I've seen that many times with people justify their actions, but well, God told me to do so. That's very self-serving. We need to recognize our need to be in control and our need for simple explanations. Always helpful to consult other people. Community is important both actually in science and in faith. And then finally, at a spiritual level, in sort of analyzing an event, we can think about, does it glorify God? Is it something consistent with what the Bible teaches? Do we see fruit of the Spirit arising from it? But perhaps more importantly, we need the humility, and we need to embrace uncertainty, and we need to trust in God rather than in our circumstances. So we can trust a certain God is working in an uncertain world. We can trust that no matter what happens, God is with us. He doesn't necessarily make things happen either the way we want or the way we don't want, but he is with us through all the struggles. And we need to be sensitive to people who have more struggles than we do. So, for example, this happens in church where somebody is praising God because they got healed, but what about the person next to them that didn't get healed? So we need to be careful about that. In general, we want to be precise. We want to know the questions we're asking and recognize the multiple different levels. And at this point, I will turn it over to you for questions. I realize some things I've just touched on fairly briefly, but I'm happy to address any questions at this point.
Hi, Janet. Thank you so much for an engaging talk. It was very educational. I learned a lot, and it was very, what can I say? It really challenged sometimes the way I think and the way I look at everyday life. So personally, I took a lot away from this talk. Thank you so much. So as we're waiting for people to kind of populate the chat with any questions, not the chat, but the Q&A function, with any questions that they may have, I just have this simple question for you, Janet. So as a psychotherapist, how do you navigate helping people change their perspectives when various challenging life issues come about? You gave an example of cancer earlier, or of different types of challenges, and people are really trying to find that cause, make that connection. Sometimes maybe this is God's fault, or maybe I did something wrong. How do you help people see things differently and perhaps switch from that mindset to a bit of what we're discussing tonight?
Right.
I realize that, hey, sometimes maybe it's random.
So it is actually easier in psychotherapy, and I mean, not always, but first of all, you're dealing with one-on-one, which is usually easier than dealing sort of at a group population kind of level. Second of all, people who come for psychotherapy, despite people thinking it's only for the week and it's a crutch, it's actually people who come already have some courage and some level of humility. They realize they have a problem and they want to change. So in many ways, I have a slightly easier audience. And often my approach is to be actually quite irritating, and I just ask people more questions. So, instead of if they say something outrageous, I won't just say, well, that's not true, because that's not helpful. I think, why do you believe that? How is that helping? How is that belief helping you? And so just really to help them gain more self-awareness. And then it's quite interesting because sometimes after a few sessions, I haven't even said anything, and maybe the particular issue we haven't even addressed in the last couple of sessions, and they'll come back and say, yeah, I think I've changed my mind on that, or something. So but it is a process, and with some people it's more difficult than others, but it's really about helping them understand what's lying underneath the surface.
Thank you so much for sharing, Janet. And I see we have a few questions here in the Q&A. The first one is by an anonymous attendee who's asking, do you think God used natural disasters to punish people in the Old Testament times?
Sorry, God, I'm just, your volume's a little low.
Oh, do you think God used natural disasters to punish people in Old Testament?
Right. So, yeah, the whole Old New Testament is complex. There are definitely some specific examples where, not even so. Actually, the examples are more about God using the people of the nations to punish Israel. There are times where it's indirect and it seems like it, but it's not necessarily that God caused it particularly, but that he reinterpreted it or used it in a specific context. So, sorry, that's not a very straight answer. I guess the simple answer that it's complicated.
I imagine with most things it is complicated. Hard to give a simple answer, but thank you for that, Janet. So we have a question here from John. How do you see what you've said fitting with someone praying to God for leading or direction? Does he answer, or is the answer just a random happening?
Okay, so that's very different. In fact, that's how I would encourage people to pray for guidance. And there's lots of biblical examples of that, and experiential as well. So and that's what I said before about focusing on character rather than circumstances, which again, I think is what the Bible points to. And also recognizing us working with God. So that's what we want to do. We want to pray for guidance, how God can use us, how we can best serve him. Those are the sort of things that we want to pray for. Now, I'm not a cessationist. I do believe that miracles can still happen. And so I don't have any problem with praying for healing, praying for divine intervention. But recognizing that it's probably more the exception than the norm. So, yeah, absolutely. So we do both is what I would say. So we pray for healing, but we also pray for the hospital workers who are, helping people to heal. I would say praying in many different ways is always helpful. Can never go wrong.
Thank you. So the next question here is from Bob. He's asking, has all the current virus research helped us to learn any more about how evolution operates?
That's a good one. I'm not sure about that. I'm not an evolutionary biologist in any sense. If somebody in the audience has an answer to that, feel free to type it in the chat or something. My guess would be maybe, but I don't know enough.
Neither do I. I wish I could comment or jump in a little more with that one, but so we'll have to wait for the experts to provide more. It's from an anonymous attendee who's asking, what do you make of Jesus's explanations for why someone was born blind, etc.?
That's an excellent example of random causation in the Bible. And when I say random, it can be sort of random or unknown or natural factors. Those can all be sort of lumped together in the Bible. And it's a specific teaching. In terms of illness causation, and I deal with that a lot in my book, there's instances where God does cause an illness. In the New Testament, actually, one of the primary cause of illness is evil spirits. We see, and then the teaching in John is in response to the disciples assuming that somebody's sin caused an illness. Now, there are occasions where sin is a factor. But his teaching in that, the man born blind, is that no particular cause. And actually, many times throughout the Bible, it's just sort of the passive tense, somebody became sick or somebody was sick, and it's not really explained. And it's particularly interesting that biblical authors were usually a lot more concerned with where is God? Is God with me? They were more concerned with the the philosophical type of questions than the scientific type of questions. So we have to be very careful about going back and with our scientific minds to look at the Bible. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you for that, Janet. So the next question we have here is from Dana. She's saying, thanks for an interesting talk as usual. Is there anything that you would say is meant to be or fated to happen, etc.? Or do you think it's almost always random, but an effect of large numbers?
So yeah, I would need some examples to know what she's specifically meaning, but certainly from the Christian worldview, big picture, yeah, I think it's clear that, when you talk about God's will, God's plan, it's clear that God wants everyone to come to knowledge, a saving knowledge of Christ. It's clear that there is going to be an end to the world and a new creation, and Jesus is going to come again. And I believe at times if God needs to intervene in human history to bring about that bigger picture, he will do so. But that does not mean that he's intervening in every little circumstance along the way. I also think that the church is a somewhat sort of protective factor, if you like, in the world. And even though we see a lot of violence today, if you look back to pre-Christian times, it was a lot worse. So, I think that's a mitigating factor and not a definite thing, but something that is an example of how large numbers can be helpful. But let me just see if Dana had any specific, I'm not big about the fated to happen. And I wouldn't say always random, because random is not necessarily, some of it like cause and effect is, you could say is gravity random. It's something that's relatively predictable. There are some things in nature that are, like when I talked about order and regularity. So I wouldn't say that everything's always random. And again, with large numbers of people, you can make predictions based on large numbers. That's how insurance companies work. There was something else. I don't think the word fate is helpful.
Thank you, Janet. Sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off.
Nope.
All right. So moving on to the next question by Charles. In Ontario, many in long-term care homes died from COVID. Was this bad luck, something random? Or had the operators of the homes the power to prevent deaths but failed to do so?
Yes, and yes. There's elements. So when we look at, one of the going back to the population versus individuals, institutions versus individuals, in terms of which particular person died, that would be relatively random. Although another helpful term is contributing factors as opposed to causing factors, right? Because there's multiple contributing factors. So the people who were already sick, the sickest beforehand, would be the more likely to A, get the virus, and B, get more sick from it. But certainly, I do think there's some responsibility to be had in the organization of, not all, again, we must be careful not to generalize, but in some of the homes. And some of it was just because certainly at the beginning, we didn't have as much knowledge about transmission, etc. So it's, again, be careful of hindsight judgments, because it's easy to look back and say, well, I should have done that and should have done that.
Thank you. So we have a question by another anonymous attendee. I sometimes think that almost every happening can be interpreted in terms of randomness or in terms of providence, or both. Do you think invoking providence is purely a matter of faith?
Okay, so providence is a big issue, and there's many different interpretations of providence. In general, and again, it's something I do deal with quite a bit in the book. In general, providence is sort of God's care for the world, but I believe God's care is in a general sense, and I believe part of God's care is requiring and commanding us to take responsibility. I don't interpret providence in terms of God micromanaging and creating everything anew each time, and making each leaf fall to the ground, etc. So I don't interpret providence in that sense. It is a very misunderstood concept, and like I said, there's different models of how we understand it. Again, I would not want to think in terms of black and white, that it's either providence or either random. A lot of it is just the way the world works, the way that God has created the world. And since nobody's really brought this up yet, remember too that our sin has tainted the world. So some of the things that happen, not even necessarily at an individual level, but at a broad societal level, is a result of corruption from human sin. So multiple different factors, and often difficult to sort out. But in terms of like purely random, I don't think there's a lot that's purely random. We see it as random because there's multiple different factors that are contributing causes.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Donald. What are your thoughts about moral causation in the Bible, i.e. a recurring theme in the Old Testament stresses obedience equals blessing, disobedience equals judgment? And Donald follows up with another comment saying, this is generally taken as a collective or national level with the people of Israel.
Right, so two good points. Again, the difference between Old Testament and New, God was working very closely and specifically with the people of Israel. Now, God works through the church, the Holy Spirit who indwells us. So I do think it is somewhat different in the times we're living in now, the already but not yet. The kingdom has been ushered in, but not completely fulfilled. So I think we have to be careful about drawing exact comparisons. Because, that was a common theme in the Old Testament, the blessings and curses. So I just, and it's certainly possible that there is some degree that it continues today, but we have to be very careful with that because, it's the old, why do good things happen to bad people? And the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. So I think we have to be careful about, yes, it is a biblical theme, but we have to be careful about how we apply it today. And then the second concept is the corporate versus individual. So I think a lot of those verses in the Bible that talk about like election verses, for example, that God calls people, I think he calls people as a group, not necessarily as individuals. And the same with sort of cause and effect relationships. I think what we can learn from statistics and probability theory can actually be useful in our understanding about how God works in the world.
Thank you. So we have a few comments here from Dana. I think these were follow-ups from the previous question about faith. She gave specific examples about meeting someone or maybe having to move to a specific destination to get your dream job. I'm not sure if you want to expand further on that or if you feel you elaborated sufficiently.
No, because okay, so that's a slightly sort of different thing, and that's one I commonly hear. So one example I met somebody randomly in a parking lot, conference meeting or whatever, and we later became friends, and she said, oh, God orchestrated it all. And so, in analyzing it, and I was irritating, well, there's a high probability that God orchestrated it, because when you look at, okay, if there's quite a few different circumstances that come together, but I think we have to be very, very careful because there's a lot of stuff that we attribute to providence that is actually just the way the world works. So we meet somebody that we haven't, so maybe we're thinking of somebody and then they phone, like that's a common one. It's like, oh, fate, God, providence, whatever. But I would challenge you all to write down the number of times you think about somebody and then keep note of how many times somebody calls after you've thought about them and how many times they don't call. So you think of somebody and nobody calls. We don't remember those occasions. We only remember the occasions where something happens. So the whole coincidence thing, oh, there's no such thing as coincidence. Yes, they are. Coincidences happen. And they're actually more common than what we think. And when we think about them, or like you meet somebody in a crowded place that maybe a friend you haven't seen in a while, oh, God brought us together. Well, okay, it's a crowded place. There's a large population of people, so thinking about the statistical probabilities, it's actually higher than what we think. Another common one in statistics is the birthday problem. And I think it's something like if you've got 40 people in a room, there's an 80% chance, never mind, a large number of them will share a birthday. And it seems like it's huge, but when we actually look at the numbers, it's not that surprising. So it also goes back to, remember, we talked about the silent evidence that we neglect. So we only think about things that are relevant to us and things that make sense. And we all like these meaningful stories, remember? So these coincidences happen. It's like, oh, yeah, but yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is from Heather, perhaps in a similar vein to the question just asked. How would you put COVID into a framework of all things working together for good?
Yep, I was waiting for that one. So another verse, along with the Jeremiah 29, I know the plans I have for you, but another verse that's overquoted and misunderstood. So you have to remember the context of Romans, what was going on there and what Paul was teaching, and that it's not necessarily applicable to every situation. And you have to remember that, yeah, God can bring good out of things, but that does not mean that he caused it in the first place. So we look at some of the things that happened in the pandemic, that have been positives, like people being good neighbors and connecting. There's been a lot of positive, and that's where I see God working through people in the pandemic. But it doesn't mean that the whole pandemic has been good. I'd say that, like most situations, there has been some good that has come out of it. And yeah, we can thank God for that, for sure. And even, the prayers, like I myself and many of us, I'm sure, were praying for the scientists to develop a vaccine and develop cures. Well, I do see that as some answers to prayers. So, but we've got to think about it in this sort of big picture, multiple factors type way.
Thank you. So we have a question here from another anonymous attendee. Do you think that anything is random from God's perspective or just ours?
So yeah, that's a good one, and it's a difficult one. So and that's where we have to talk about, which I didn't get into, but the two types of randomness. So there's ontological or actual randomness, and that is what happens at the quantum level. So radioactive decay, for example, is a truly random process. And no, God does not know that. That's not a perspective thing. That is the way he has created the world. Second type of randomness is epistemological or apparent randomness. And that applies to most of what we call random in terms of chaos complexity type things, too many factors interacting. So the roll of a dice, for instance, would be an example of that. It's and even random number generators. So it seems random, but the dice are actually influenced by their weight, the way you toss it, the airflow around them, and multiple different factors, but too many for us to ever be able to figure out that in all apparent effects it is random. So I would certainly say that yeah, God could know all those different factors. But then you might question, does he need to know them? And anyway.
Thank you, Janet. So the next question here is from AJ. Do you agree with Whitehead's ideas that our free will and random chance may strongly affect us, but God beckons us towards the right path. How do you interpret this?
Right. So that's a good one. I'm just trying to think who was it Whitehead. Yeah, so process theology. Yes, I do not agree with all aspects of process theology, because process theology, I think, it limits God too much. They will say that God's abilities are only through persuasion and nothing else. I would argue that probably the primary way that God works in the world is through persuasion, is through turning our hearts towards him, pursuing us, convicting us of sin, convicting us towards good action. So yes, absolutely believe that's a primary way that he works. But of course, we need to be in tune to his spirit. We need to be obedient and listening and following him.
Thank you. And we have a comment here from Judith. Thank you, Judith. She's just thanking you for the talk, Janet. And we have a question from another anonymous attendee asking, God created us wanting us to love him. Love is only meaningful if we are free to love him or not. We can be manipulated by the actions and promises of others. God could easily manipulate us into loving him by controlling events around us. Is this why miracles are so rare, so that we can truly be free? Interesting question.
So the first is really more a statement, and I would absolutely agree with that. In case you haven't figured out, I'm very much a free will theist. But in terms of the miracle question, I'm not sure it's completely related to freedom. So one of the things when you look at the literature on healing, for example, which is one of the most common miracles we see, it's largely in areas of the world, in areas of missionary expansion. And actually, when you look at Paul's missionary journeys, that was commonly when people were converted, when the Holy Spirit acted, when deliverances and healings happened. In fact, healing and salvation, the terms, the Greek terms are very closely, the terms and the concepts in the Bible are very closely related. So I do think that it's not just about freedom, because I think that a lot of the healings are a way that God uses to convert people to faith, to draw him to them. But yeah, ultimately it is their freedom and their choice, and that God doesn't intervene. So I would have to maybe think about it more. So I'd say it's possibly a reason. But, and we have to remember too that the miracles, even in the Bible, Jesus didn't heal everybody. The point of the miracles was theological. It was to show that his kingdom had arrived. It wasn't, he did have compassion on people as well, but that was not the primary point of the miracles. And we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at miracles.
Thank you. We have another question here. And it says, Stephen Law argues that there is as much evidence for an omnipotent, all evil God who allows some good in order to increase overall evil, as there is for an omnipotent, all loving God who allows some evil in order to increase overall good. What do you think of this in terms of your model of creator-creation relationship?
Okay, so I'm actually not familiar with the Stephen Law. It sounds like a sort of philosophical type argument. So the omnipotence question, I definitely would address. I'm not sure about the all loving and the all evil, but the omnipotence is, I believe that God, so not as extreme as process theology, but I believe that God self-limits himself. Like he has the power, but he chooses not to use it because he respects our freedom. So that's where I would put that in terms of my model of the creator-creation relationship. I would say that God lets creation be. He's very much, in fact, I argue, and again, I get into this more in the book, but I argue more for a model of God indwelling creation rather than acting on it from outside. So he indwells, he's within creation. So that really would be my model, but he voluntarily limits his power and chooses not to intervene, so that out of respect for the freedom that he's given to us and to the world.
Thank you, Janet. And it looks like that's the last question that we had here today. I just have one final, actually, I apologize. I skipped over one at the bottom here. It says Romans 8:28 can also be interpreted, in all things, God works together with those who love him to bring about what is good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, and actually I do have that in my book. I forgot about it momentarily because I got caught up in the common interpretations of it. Yes, so that's the NIV interpretation, and that's the one that I definitely prefer. So that's, like I said, emphasizing how God works with us, and as opposed to intervening indirectly. So yes, that I would absolutely follow that interpretation.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you whoever placed that comment, helping us put everything together well. And Janet, once again, I would like to thank you for an amazing and engaging talk. I'm sure from all these questions that were coming today, you can see how you really got us thinking.
Yeah, and I would like to thank everybody for their questions and for sticking out to the end. And thank you, Nyasha and Mark, for your help and for organizing this.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I'd like to echo Janet's sentiments. Thank you, Mark, for all your help with the tech support. We could not do this without you. And to you, who gave your evening to be with us here today, thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight.